All right, welcome back, everybody. This is our last session before we break this morning, and I'm going to very quickly turn it over to Megan Sherman, who, as you can see on the PowerPoint she's showing, she's the coordinator of Student Accessibility Services. She has a lot of information to share with you, but it is all very, very important, and we will provide a copy of her PowerPoint in that shared drive when she finishes today. So, Megan, take it away.
Thank you. And I have slightly over-prepared, so some of this we may not get to, and that is completely fine. The first half of our presentation is what's most important and what I feel like is most vital for you to know as faculty members at the start of the semester. So as we're going through the presentation, I have chat open. If you have questions as I'm going, I can take a moment and answer any questions, but let's get right into it. So kind of an overview, we're going to start with policy review, legal review of why my office exists and what our responsibilities are under the law. Then going into what you need to know as faculty around your rights, responsibilities, and role in implementing accommodations and providing accessibility to students. Then we're going to discuss some supports of how I can support you in that measure and in accommodating students. And then we're going to go briefly into accessibility today. As Erin mentioned, I have a lot of information and there's a lot that I could share with you. I have a whole other training session about accessibility, universal design, and planning your courses in being able to support students with disabilities proactively. So that's kind of a last quarter of our presentation today, but no, I can go into much more detail with that if you have questions or need that information. We also have instructional designers who can help you with that, but we'll touch on that briefly today as well. So my name is Megan Sherman. I am housed primarily on the Lee main campus, but I do provide coverage for all 3 counties. So weekly, I have office hours on all 3 main campuses and can be available at our remote locations with prior planning and appointments. So my Sanford office on Lee campus is in Hockaday Hall. In the Chatham County building, I am either in the conference room in Building 42 or upstairs in the Academic Assistance Center. In Harnett County, my office space is in the Mariello building in the Student Services Suite. Ideally, I would like to meet with students and faculty by appointment, but if you have a timely question, email is always the best way to reach me because I am at all 3 locations weekly. And my email is not there, but it's on that first slide. So I'll put it in the chat here in just a second, or Erin, if you know it, you can put it in the chat for me, please. So our institutional policies around individuals with disabilities is essentially a non-discrimination notice. We have a non-discrimination notice about access and opportunity to our academic programs. We also have a non-discrimination notice about accessibility of our online course and website. So online courses in Blackboard and our institutional social media and our website should be accessible. And what that means is equal access for individuals with disabilities. Our institutional responsibility is universal. Therefore, every program, service, or offering we offer should be considered proactively to be accessible to those who may need to participate. And again, we're going to go into what accessibility means in just a second. But as a universal policy, we do have non-discrimination notices, and that is important to know about. So, accommodation accessibility. I'm going to talk about those things throughout our presentation, so I want to start with a clear definition. Whenever we're talking about accommodation, we are talking about a modification to a course policy, programmatic structure, or procedure for a specific individual based on their specific needs. So we are accommodating or providing a reasonable modification for a specific individual. Accessibility is the proactive consideration of possible need. So universal design, if you're familiar with that as a concept, ensuring that what we post online is readable with assistive technology. Both of these, and there's much more to accessibility than that, but as a brief overview, both of these are vital and required under the law. So today I'm going to focus primarily on accommodation and supporting individual students who may be in your classes, but we will touch on accessibility as a universal theme. This kind of goes into more detail there. One student, accommodation, all students, accessibility. It is our right and responsibility as good stewards of our educational services to think about both. So who qualifies under the law with accessibility needs and accommodations? A disability is defined as someone who has a mental, physical, or learning disability that substantially alters or limits one major life activity. So a medical diagnosis or physical attribute that limits their one major life activity. Could be one or more. So major life activities include walking, seeing, speaking, breathing, concentrating, reproducing, learning, having the ability to mobile independently across a room. So this is obviously not an exhaustive list of all disabilities, but a list of possible disabilities do include diabetes, complications due to pregnancy, learning disability, autism. Also short-term disabilities, like you break your arm, break your foot. Those are also considered disabilities that may require accommodation. So what we're doing here is defining the need for accommodation. Some things that are not disability: flu, simply being pregnant, or speaking a foreign language. Those are not disabling conditions, though they may limit some short-term life activity. It is not defined as a disability under the law. One clarification of that: short-term COVID is not a disability. So getting COVID and being sick for 10 to 14 days does not require accommodation or a referral to the office. Long-term COVID, so long-haul acute post-COVID syndrome, may be considered a disability and probably should be referred to the office, especially if there's a barrier in participation. So where am I getting that language from? What is a disability, barriers in participation, all of that? All of that is coming directly from the Americans with Disabilities Act, which, as a federally funded institution, we have responsibilities under the Americans with Disabilities Act. It is a civil law that supports individuals with disabilities, so individuals who rise to the level of disability, who are otherwise qualified, have the right to access public services. So being a public institution, ADA is a requirement that we have. So it is our responsibility to ensure access and participation, therefore the opportunity to participate, to all individuals who are otherwise qualified. So meet our admission standards or course requirements, technical standards, what have you. With or without accommodations, they have the opportunity to participate. Therefore, it is our responsibility to make our programs, services, and activities accessible to them. And in the law, it specifies the same information, the same benefit of access, and the same ease of access should be afforded to individuals with disabilities compared to those who are otherwise able. And so when an individual with a disability has a barrier that they are not able to participate in, that's where accommodations come in helping them access their educational opportunity. That's the whole role of my office. There is a second law that does apply to us as a federally funded institution. That is the Section 504 of the Rehabilitation Act. It is also about equal opportunity to participate and avoiding discrimination for individuals who meet that definition of disability. So what is discrimination, and so we're providing them accommodation and supporting them with accommodation, which we're going to go into more detail, and we're avoiding discrimination. We're avoiding limiting their access, denying them the benefit of services, disparate treatment, which means policies or practices that directly or indirectly create burden on an individual with a disability compared to those who are otherwise able. An example of disparate treatment would be requiring someone to do something in addition to just because they have a disability. So I can give you more examples later, but there was a situation last year at another school where the students were required to provide additional documentation for disabling condition outside of the disability services office. That could be a form of disparate treatment. Harassment or bullying because of a disability or status with the office, or retaliation for seeking accommodation, or a grievance procedure would also be considered discrimination under ADA and 504. So those things are things we want to avoid and be mindful of as we write policies and procedures. So what is a program or service that we may need to accommodate. So we've built what is a disability. We've clarified accommodations are necessary. Where might they be necessary? All programs and services that we offer, whether it's seated online courses, student activities, our social media offerings, and flyers that are put on social media, our convocation center, our continuing education classes, even if they're off-site, should also be provided accessibility or accommodation needs. Convocation, graduation, the enrollment process, everything that we do that is under the Central Carolina Community College banner should be considered accessible proactively, and then students, if needed, should be provided accommodation. So what are reasonable accommodations, and how do we define what that is? Reasonable accommodations are for students who are able to meet the essential course requirements, and then their modifications to that course requirement to help them access and participate. Types of accommodations, we're going to go into them in a minute, but the reasonable accommodation is vital to understand as we move through and start talking about the interactive process and specific accommodations. Reasonable accommodation comes directly from the law. So we have to define what is reasonable for a specific student within their course of study, and avoiding fundamental alteration. So some examples of reasonable accommodation: sign language interpreting, preferential seating, testing accommodations such as extended time or distraction-reduced environment, if necessary, flexible attendance, class in an accessible location, whatever is able to help them access and participate. I don't have a standard list of accommodation. I review for what the student needs. And then we work to define what is reasonable for their specific circumstances and what their barriers that they're experiencing due to their medical disability or diagnosis, and what is reasonable in their course of study. So what can we provide that will support their access and participation without fundamentally altering the curriculum? And I think the next one, no, I think we get to that later. But essentially, while I'm touching on it, a fundamental alteration is defined as something that would prevent the instructor or institution from being able to meet the essential learning curriculum within a program of study. So a great example from many years ago, we had developmental math, DMA 10. Students would come to me and say, I have a disability. They would provide documentation, and then we would go into the interactive process of determining what their needs are. That specific student would identify that they need a calculator for DMA 10. Unfortunately, we couldn't do that because the goal of DMA 10 was to teach students how to add, subtract, multiply, and divide. If I gave them a calculator for DMA 10, they would no longer be able to be assessed on their ability to add, subtract, multiply, and divide. They would be assessed on their ability to use a calculator. And that is a fundamental alteration of the assessment. And so that is a small example of how the interactive process helps us determine what reasonable accommodations are. I take on the responsibility of reviewing the student's needs, determining what the course requirements are, and if it is a fundamental alteration as we determine accommodation. So some other common accommodations that students might have if you get an accommodation plan for a specific student in your class: testing accommodations, assistive technology, which is again provided through my office, the use of a service animal, though they're not required to be accommodated to have a service animal, that may be on their list of accommodations. We have a separate policy about service animals that you might want to review in the policy and manual. Accessible handouts, so electronic versions of content rather than printed versions of content. Food or snack for break if they were to have regulation needs to ensure that their well-being during class, and a few others. So accommodation plans are built specifically to students, and again, we don't have a standard checklist of what is or is not possible. That is the review process for determining what is reasonable for a specific student. So I've already touched on this, but the interactive process is vital to determining accommodations. Most of the time, the interactive process is between the student, their medical documentation, which is provided directly to my office, and their study in what is written on the website, what the learning objectives are. There are times where I have to bring in faculty or other individuals from your departments to review for what is possible. And so that is what we call the interactive process, where we all come together and talk about what is vital, what is essential, not necessarily how, but what is essential to offering instruction to students. So we would look at technical standards, learning objectives, program of study, prerequisites, postrequisites. We would look at your attendance policy that's specific to your course, and really delve into what is vital and what is fundamental. And then what is the student asking for? What's the barrier that is in place? And coming to an agreement on what is reasonable under the law, and what is our institutional responsibility call for us to do. Again, the interactive process isn't necessary in every accommodation plan, but it is something that happens, especially in more non-common accommodations. That review process will take place. So I would reach out to you directly and say, we have an accommodation that we need to review for. Can we meet and discuss your course of study or your course structure? And you would be a voice in that conversation. But our ultimate decision would be based on what our legal responsibilities are, what deference we come to as an institution within that interactive process, and what's the student's needs are for that individual circumstance. So this has to be done in a timely manner. Students apply for accommodations, which I'm going to discuss in a second, and their requests are documented in writing. If it is a common accommodation, then it is written up and sent out. If it is a less common accommodation or something I'm concerned maybe rubbing that boundary of a technical standard alteration or a fundamental alteration, then that's where the interactive process comes into play. We have to do a timely, thorough, and fact-based review for those potential accommodations. So it can't be based on our opinion or our preference. It has to be based in the instruction, structure, learning objectives, and technical standards for your programs. And then we work together to come to a decision on what is possible for that specific student. And again, it may include deans, yourself as the specific instructor of a course, or a designee as approved by the VP or the president of the college. So what is your role in all of this? Following and making accommodations for specific students, determining access in your, providing access to your course and materials. So in some instances, accommodations do require modifying course material to ensure it is accessible for specific students, and then maintaining confidentiality, not discussing the accommodation plan or the nature of the student's disabilities with others who may not need to know. So typically that includes a need to know would be my office if you have concerns or questions, your dean if you have concerns or questions, or speaking directly with the student appropriately as needed. Some faculty rights as we're talking about accommodations, maintaining the academic standard of your course, determining course content and how it will be taught. So you still have instructor deference on how you teach your course and what you teach. We just have the responsibility to ensure that how it's taught is accessible. Then confirming the student's accommodation plan, which is emailed to you if you have a student with accommodation in your class. Denying a request for an accommodation if it is not documented in an accommodation plan, or if you don't have an accommodation plan for that specific student. I would encourage you to refer the student to me, but if the student is asking for an accommodation, and that may sound like I have blank disorder and I need blank support, you have the right to deny that and refer them to my office. If it's something that you would do for any student in your class, say the one chance to turn in homework that's late and every student in your class gets benefit of that in that policy, I would still encourage you to provide them that benefit because everybody else has that benefit. But if it is an ongoing situation, after that one time, I would refer them to my office if it's based on their disability. So again, if a student comes to you and says, because of XYZ diagnosis, I need XYZ support, and that's something you wouldn't do for anybody, you need to refer them to my office. If they say that same thing, and it's something you would do once for everybody as a one chance opportunity to turn in work late. Take them at their word, support them within your course policy, but also refer them to my office for ongoing support. And then the other two are self-explanatory. So where rights are limited, you can't ask for documentation for a student. I know there are COVID policies in place. I'm not talking about that. But if a student were to come to you and say they have diabetes, please don't ask them for documentation or go into that. Simply refer them to my office if they need support. You need to follow the accommodation plan as it's written. If you're concerned that it may be a fundamental alteration, you have the right to let me know that, and we will do a review of what's appropriate. And then I would ask that you not inquire, if you receive an accommodation plan from a student, I would ask that you not inquire as to what their disability is. That's private information, and it would be inappropriate to ask them about why they need the accommodation plan. If you have concerns about how best, definitely I am here to help, and if I have consent from the student, I can share a bit more information with you, and we're definitely here to help make sure that the accommodation plan is implemented as appropriate. But as far as medical sensitive information, I would really encourage not asking that of the student. So some responsibilities, some of which we've taken care of today: understanding the college's guidelines and laws that apply to accommodating students, referring students to accessibility services, reviewing your email for notices. So at the start of each semester, I email out accommodation plans to faculty who, for students who have approved for their accommodation plan to go out. And that starts the week before classes start, and then you may get accommodations through October or November. Students may have temporary disabilities or need more time to get documentation in order. So I do email out accommodations in a timely manner, but it may happen throughout the entire semester. So search my name every once in a while in your email box. We need to provide those accommodations, and it is your responsibility to support that and implementation. We do have faculty and staff here on campus who can help you if you need support. Maintaining confidentiality and providing those accessible handouts like we talked about earlier. So some student responsibilities, I'm not going to go too far into this because it is specific to students. Students have to self-identify to request accommodations. That comes directly from a student-initiated process that is documented on our website. There's a form they have to fill out, or they meet with me directly to start that. If they end up coming to you and say, I have a 504 plan or I had an IEP, that is also considered self-identifying to the college, and you should refer them to me for that support. 504 plans and IEPs are what accommodation plans are called in high school. So, sorry. Students have the right and responsibility to accommodations if they're approved. They have the right to schedule with Academic Assistance Center if they need support. And they have the right to let me know if there's a concern or change in their status throughout the semester. So how does all of this happen? If a student comes to you, you can do a direct referral if they self-identify to you. So they say something along the lines of, I have XYZ diagnosis, direct referral. So I have diabetes, I have ADHD, I have cerebral palsy, I have a disability or a medical condition, and you believe it may be a disability, because you're not there to determine whether or not it's a disability, but they inform you that they have a medical condition. You refer them to my office, and you can do that by pulling up the website and sharing that with them. You could do that by sending them an email with my contact information. You could do that by sharing a RAC card with them if we are in person. And I can give you RAC cards if you need those. They're just information cards with the office information on them. So again, if a student comes directly to you and says, I disclose this to you, you have the right to inform them about my office and make sure that they know about their right to request accommodation. If they talk around it, so they start saying, I have this symptom, I can't focus, I can't concentrate, I'm having trouble reading or seeing, I would not directly refer, because then we're assuming that they are disabled, and that gets into some disparate treatment concerns. In that case, if they talk around it, I would encourage you to ensure that they are aware of the syllabus statement that you may be included at the start of the semester about services and programs across campus. So there are several it would sound something like, if there are several offices across campus who can support you, Academic Assistance Center offers tutoring. Our success coaches may be able to meet with you and talk about that area of concern. And just in case you have questions, there's also accessibility services that may be an opportunity to receive support. And so I would, again, not do a direct referral, but kind of talk to them about relative supports that you believe may be helpful. Yes, you raised your hand. Sorry, I didn't see who that was.
No, I apologize. It was a mistake.
Okay, that's okay. I just wanted to make sure. So that is a referral process. And so what are you referring them to? I'm gonna come back to, so in a second we're gonna get to that. Sorry, my slides are a little bit out of order, I apologize. But we're gonna get back to what are you referring to? What is the process that will happen once you refer them to me? But first I do want to make a note about dual enrolled students. I think it's about a fourth, if not more, of our students are dual enrolled, who may be in high school and college at the same time. And it happens ever so often that an EC counselor at a high school will send faculty of the college an IEP plan or 504 plan that they created. You are not to follow that one. That was built specifically under the regulations and policies of the high school and the K-12 guidance, and that is not applicable to classes that they are receiving college credit for. You are only responsible to follow accommodation plans that are authored through my office and approved by the college. So if a student comes to you, if a guidance counselor reaches out to you and says, here's my IEP, here's my 504 plan, you have no responsibility to that. I would respectfully encourage you to respectfully inform the student that I understand you have a need that needs to be met. Unfortunately, I can't follow this plan. What would be most appropriate is if you reach out to accessibility services at the college and discuss your needs directly with that office. And then if a plan is approved through accessibility services, I'll support you in class as needed. And that way you're keeping a line of communication open with the student, but you're referring them to an appropriate place where they can get the support that they need. Again, it's talked about at orientation for students. It's in syllabus statements. It's on our website, but some students miss it. And I've had meetings with EC counselors, but some of them miss it. So just know that that is not your responsibility to follow a 504 IEP plan, even if you're teaching at the college, at the high school. So even if your class meets at the high school, you need to follow the college plan and not the IEP. If you have questions about that, let me know. And here's the reason why. There's huge differences in the regulations in high school as compared to college. Huge maybe is an overstatement. There are differences between the high school policies, practices, regulations than the post-secondary policies and practices. Namely, students have to self-identify. We do not provide assessments. We do not reach out to students who are failing and assume they are disabled. They have to self-identify to request accommodations. We do not make course modifications that would fundamentally alter curriculum. And there are a few other things that we do and don't do, but there's a difference. Therefore, the plan has to be created specific to the college regulations and policies. So what are students going to do if you refer them to me or they have a 504 plan or IEP and they self-identify? Students must self-identify, and that can be emailing me, calling me, or filling out the packet. Once I'm notified that a student has a need, I send them a welcome letter and the requirements for the process. The requirements namely are the identification packet where they write down their specific symptoms that they're experiencing, previous accommodations that they may have received, what specific accommodations they believe would be necessary to help them participate in the educational environment at college, a consent form, and a schedule request form. Once that documentation is done, next step is medical documentation. Sometimes these forms these parts come in together, but oftentimes they'll fill out the identification packet and then I follow up with them requesting medical documentation. Our medical documentation standards require proof of diagnosis, symptoms, and an overview of their health status from a medical healthcare provider who is licensed to diagnose in their area of concern. I don't expect this is anything that you all will talk to a student about, as much as I want you to understand that the medical documentation is there to support and clinically identify what their area of concern is. And then I use that to see if they meet the definition of a disability. So is this a medical diagnosis that substantially limits one or more life area? And if so, how? Therefore, the how is what we address in building the accommodation plan. Once both of those packets are with me, so the identification packet and the medical documentation, I review that, considering what courses they're registered for, what course of study they're in, and would initiate the interactive process if necessary. If it is a common accommodation and the nexus between all of those needs are clear, it may not require the interactive process. Therefore, I would meet with the student at that time, discuss their need, do a clinical interview with them one-on-one, and then an accommodation plan would be drafted and sent out to faculty or staff if they're working with someone on campus in a tutoring capacity or a success coach capacity. Once the accommodation plan is approved, it's emailed directly to faculty for implementation. So during my meeting with the student, we do a clinical interview, we discuss their symptoms, their needs, and we get really specific on what their needs are, and then when necessary, initiate that interactive process that I went through. So that process is the initiation of an accommodation plan, the first steps whenever a student needs an accommodation plan and hasn't had one previously. Returning students do have to fill out one form each semester. So accommodation plans are authored by semester because, again, we're considering your course requirement and learning objectives if we have to do that interactive review. So at the start of each semester, students fill out a student schedule request form. That informs me of what classes they're registered for and that they are giving me permission to share their accommodation plan with you. I email accommodation plans directly to faculty, attaching the accommodation plan, a test cover sheet, and other relevant information that may be needed to implement accommodation. So if there's guidance or policies that are specific to something in that accommodation plan, you may get additional attachments, but at minimum, you'll have instructions on how to review an accommodation plan with a student, some vital information about utilizing the Academic Assistance Center for testing, and then a test cover sheet that you'll use for the Academic Assistance Center, and the accommodation plan specific to that student and that semester, and any other relevant course policies or procedures. At that point, I also send an email to the student. So I email you, and in that same instance, I email the student. It is expected that you guys will meet within the first week of the semester to review the accommodation plan and discuss that with them in as much detail as possible. And I think my next slide, yeah. So how do you implement accommodations once you've been notified via email? Instructors should review the accommodation plan one-on-one. So I want you to print it and I want you to review it. If anything's unclear or you're not sure what it means, reach out to me, ask me a question. I try and make it as clear as possible. But again, there may be accommodations that you aren't familiar with or haven't had to implement before. Bring your questions to my attention and I will reply in a meaningful, quick way. Seek resources from myself, distance education, or instructional designers, or our library if you need support ensuring your course is accessible. We have a great tool built into Blackboard called Ally that you can check your course accessibility and if course content is accessible. So if you see an accommodation plan that says read aloud, you may need to ensure that your materials are accessible to assistive technology that will read that information out loud. But again, all of that would be in an accommodation plan if you need to know that. So implementation of accommodation should be complete and not be removed because of grades or behavior. So we can't punish a student or remove their accommodations at any point in time. So whether they're passing, they're failing, they have access to their accommodation plan. Now, if they violate the code of conduct, the standard of code of conduct still applies to students with accommodation plans. So that was a whole nother issue, but we can't remove the supports from an accommodation plan for any reason. With one exemption, if a student has a service animal and that service animal is not in control of the handler or acting appropriately, that student can be dismissed for the day. You should notify security and my office if that happens. And once the behavior is rectified, then the animal and the student may return. Once the animal's off campus, the student should be allowed to return to class without penalty. If you want more information about service animals, there's a policy in our handbook, but that is the only instance where we could remove a student from a class for an accommodation. And I would not do that without consulting with security first. If you need information about reformatting content or setting test exceptions, that information can be found on the distance education website, or again, I have it in my office. My apologies. So once you've reviewed the accommodation plan, if you have questions, you've brought that to my attention. If there's other supports that you need, we've rectified that. Meeting with that student is the next step. So you would meet with them in private, one-on-one, remotely, on the phone, or in person, privately discuss the accommodation. So go bullet by bullet on what you see and how you interpret that and how that accommodation would look in your class. So an example, you have 50% extended time on testing. I will make test exceptions in Blackboard for you, extending your test time. You have distraction reduced environment. So you're going to schedule with the Academic Assistance Center to take your tests on campus, or you're going to take your tests at home online. So distraction reduced environment is up to you to coordinate in your setting at home. That's just two examples of what you might do as you go through those bullet points. The student may add more information about what their needs are or ask questions about course content or course structure during that meeting as well. So being prepared to address where layouts are going to be located on Blackboard. If you have other proctors prepared to support students, how you're going to implement the accommodation plan in general. Any questions about meeting with the student? Anything that you might need more clarity on? That conversation really sets the tone for how the accommodation plan will be implemented. Typically, I tell students that they only meet with instructors to review the accommodation plan at the start of the semester and then prior to each test for the first month or so to make sure that the plan is clear. If you have pop quizzes, I would encourage you to plan ahead and coordinate proctors for students with testing accommodations. And if you have other needs, again, we can talk about that as you receive accommodation plans, but I don't see any questions, so I'm going to keep on going. So because we're talking about federal rights and responsibilities and the right to access and participate, students do have the right to submit a grievance procedure should there be a concern about the implementation of their accommodation plan or access in general at the college. Students can raise that concern in writing by filling out the grievance procedure on the website. That starts with me and then goes to the Dean of Student Services, Dean Willett, and then goes to the VP of Student Services, VP Hoyle, and then the president if necessary. During that process, we would get student statements and information and then do the same for any faculty or staff that are involved, getting facts and information from Blackboard if it's related to Blackboard implementation, getting information from you as a faculty member, and completing an investigation similar to what a code of conduct investigation would be within our course policies and procedures. Typically, those grievance procedures are have to be rectified in a timely manner. So typically within 30 days, we have to come to some sort of conclusion or remedy. I encourage students to bring up concerns in a timely manner. If it's something simple, then it's remedied quickly. And again, if it requires investigation, that would happen as well. The grievance procedure is posted at the bottom of the web page, should you need access to that or should you have any questions. What else do you need to know? So sometimes this slide comes from best practices and previous interactions with faculty, staff, and students from myself and from other schools. Sometimes whenever students self-identify to faculty want to recommend specific accommodations to students, will ask Ms. Sherman for this or ask Ms. Sherman for that. I would encourage you to not do that because in that conversation, you could come across as verifying that they are disabled, so determining eligibility, and the student may not be eligible for those specific programs and practices or assistive technologies. Everything is based on an individual consideration of what their needs are, and while I am not trying to prevent anyone from using things to the full benefit or full access, for what their needs are. I have to base it in what we can document and what's reasonable in your course of study. Please follow the plan that is written for the student, and it's not really a pick and choose sort of plan. It does need to be implemented in the full extent. If there is concern about it being unreasonable for your course or program of study, we can discuss that, but it should be implemented to the fullest extent as written. Offer the student the same benefit of other policies and procedures. So if you give everybody that one chance to turn in work late and the student is accommodated for one extra day to turn in work, then they would get benefit of both policies. So the accommodation is in addition to the course program of study and the course policies that you already have in place. And as we've already discussed, confidentiality is important. I'm going to skip, because you guys are going to get access to this, I'm going to skip to the next part really quickly. But before I do so, are there any questions about accommodation plans, implementation of accommodations, based on what we've talked about so far? All right. So just to touch on it, because I want you guys to know that these things exist and that they are important. Proactively planning for accessibility as you design your course, as you plan your physical space in your classroom, and as you email and communicate with students is going to be important to ensure that we are not inadvertently creating additional barriers to students. So considering the ease of access for students to come in and out of your physical spaces, would a student with a wheelchair be able to access your classroom or office without burden or concern? If not, then what can we do to remedy that? Would students be able to interact with your course announcements and emails effectively? Meaning, are we making our font size smaller on our emails for some reason, or changing the color of our emails that don't provide clear contrast? Light purple is not accessible. So thinking about those things as you're proactively planning the communication, your course structure, your Blackboard course is important. Where do we get these standards from? There's the World Consortium of Web Accessibility and Content Guidelines. It is updated somewhat often. These guidelines are from federal practices and best practices to ensure that what we're creating online is accessible. There's a separate set of guidelines from the Americans with Disabilities Act about our physical spaces, about how wide an aisleway should be, how high a desk should be, those kinds of things. And typically those are considered by the college before you come into your classroom, but if you move your furniture around, I would encourage you to think about that. And I can give you more information about that. So again, physical spaces and online spaces should both be accessible to ensure that all of our content is perceivable, operable, understandable, and robust. These are words that come directly from those guidelines I just mentioned and are kind of the foundation of what we need from accessibility. I want to skip to Ally because I want you guys to know that this tool exists in Blackboard. You may have already done Blackboard training or familiar with Ally from other institutions. Ally is a tool that's built into Blackboard that allows you to check if your course content is accessible. So a green Ally bar up here where it says 93 is great. I think anything over 85 turns green. If it's yellow, you're good. There might still be a little bit of work to do. But Ally can help you check your course content that you put up in Blackboard. There's also web accessibility checkers built into Word, PowerPoint, and Excel, I believe. And Adobe Acrobat Pro DC also has an accessibility checker in it. So as you build content for your courses, you could proactively check your accessibility to ensure that if a student with an accommodation plan needed to have accessible content from your course, there's no additional work that you need to do. You just need to support them as you would any other student. So by proactively planning for accessibility, there's less that you would need to do in modifying your course or implementing an accommodation plan later. And honestly, it's not if you'll need an accommodation plan, it's when at this point. Approximately a third of our students may be eligible for accommodations, and in looking at our statistics over the last 4 years, typically we have 1 to 3 students per class who have accommodations. So that it's not a matter of if, it's more a matter of when. So some other key components of accessibility: color contrast, tables, font size, alt text, captions. We have a lot of institutional resources around accessibility within our instructional designers and institutional effectiveness office. I have a whole nother training that goes into accessibility in more detail that again can help you proactively plan for accommodations and ensure that access is afforded to all of your students regardless of disability. And honestly, that's really the goal of accessibility. So I've covered a little bit about accessibility and a lot about accommodation. Again, you're going to get a copy of this presentation. If you guys have specific questions now, I'm happy to talk. If you want to turn off the recording, that way you're got a little bit more privacy.